Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am Beverly, a graduate writing consultant at the Writing Hub with UC San Diego. This workshop is part of a new series that we are pioneering this quarter, spring 2021. And this is going to be a virtual walkthrough of a workshop that was given synchronously this quarter on research statements for the academic job market. So, part of this series on this academic job market support series. So the first thing I want to do is I want you to get started thinking about the content or the just essentially with your research right away. So we're going to do a couple of free write exercises. So there is a companion worksheet that you can download and walk along throughout. There'll be a couple of moments throughout this workshop where I'll ask you to pause the video and you can interact with the worksheet. So these would be moments in the workshop where we paused and did activities to then share afterward. And I want you to have that kind of like similar sort of experience because I think these workshops are most effective when you can actively engage in them. So that means it is really worthwhile and I think to your benefit to work through and do these exercises kind of as you follow along with these workshops. So there's a couple of different options for this first free write exercise. So I essentially just want you to be actively thinking about how you're framing your research and how you're writing your statements throughout. So not just when we get to the end. Um, and it's really important to be thinking about your research in ways that will help you create a coherent, compelling, and comprehensive statement about who you are as scholars. And so sometimes it helps to kind of break out of the typical genre conventions or um, the typical space that you're thinking about when you are explaining your research. So that said, maybe just pause this video and take 5 minutes to think through one or all of these exercises. So think about how did you get started in this research? Maybe describe a time you had to pivot. This is a word we're using a lot these days. Maybe a time you had to pivot in your research. You can do a fill in the blank. One of the things I most enjoy about the process of research is blank because blank. And one of the things I'm kind of hoping that sometimes happens when you're working on these statements is this process of rediscovery of joy related to your research. I think a lot of us get into research because there's some aspect of it that we find really appealing or that brings us a lot of joy. And sometimes just kind of in the day to day, this can be sort of ground out of us. So I hope one of the things that you'll take away from this workshop is kind of a rediscovery of the things about your research that bring you joy. If you're feeling really creative, maybe you want to do a research haiku for your future research hopes and dreams. So again, this is going to be a little poem that's 5 syllables and 7 syllables and then 5 syllables. So maybe what you want to do is a future research haiku. So at this moment in time, just pause the video and then we'll come back together. Welcome back. So another one of the, or another name that we were thinking about when we were thinking about this workshop was calling this workshop the third path for research statements. Um, and I hope you'll kind of see where we're coming from as I explain this a little bit more. So as part of preparing for this workshop, we tried to distill principles from all of the advice that's out there in a sort of humane way. So, working on these statements is really stressful enough. So, if you've seen the first video in this series or gone to the first workshop in this series about preparing for the academic job market, um, you might have seen some, or you will have seen some discussion about how this is a very stressful process because it's part of this culminating activity of you as a scholar that you've been building towards throughout your time as a graduate student, throughout your time as a postdoc researcher, wherever you are in this stage of the academic job market. And so, what we're going to try to do throughout these workshops is shed some of the unhelpful advice and use some of these strategies that we learned in this previous workshop. And so there is a lot of advice out there about creating research statements. There is some good advice, there's some bad advice, there's some ugly advice, and there's some that kind of, falls in between. But one of the things that I want you to be thinking about when you're intaking in this advice, because you are all researchers, so you are probably doing a lot of research about how to write research statements, is to just be wary of prescriptive rules. So when people are giving advice, they will tend to give advice, not only about their particular perspective on things, not only about what they did, but also what they wish they did, and maybe through people they know did. So just kind of as you're seeing and taking in all of this advice, and this includes for this workshop, take what is helpful about this advice and then leave whatever is not helpful behind. That's totally okay. And I promise we will not be offended. So, as with many things, crafting good, writer responsible research statements is going to be about balance. And so I want to unpack what I mean by writer responsible really quickly for you. So, kind of in the West, we have this idea that writers are responsible for how their texts are received, which means it's really important when you're writing text to be thinking about how your audience might receive them. And so you want to be responsible in the content you are conveying and in how you are conveying that. And one of these things, or one of the principles that you can use to craft so called good, writer responsible research statements, is going to be about balance. And so some of the things that you'll need to be thinking about are the balance between you as the researcher and the research agenda, the balance in writing these statements between being audience aware and audience mind reading, balance between ambition and feasibility of the research, as well as balance between providing not enough detail and too much detail. And don't worry if you're confused at this point or think things are unclear, we will unpack each of these things in turn. And so, just kind of a funnier way of thinking about it is, just as a reminder, when you look for information or get feedback, you can kind of take what's helpful, leave the rest behind. Remember, everything is just everybody's opinion at the end of the day. Okay, so when we're thinking about one of these principles, or when we're thinking about the principle of balance in the context of you as a researcher and the research agenda for these statements, your aim in these statements is going to be a good colleague in this particular institutional context that you're applying for, who is contributing to your field in multiple dimensions. So you want to convey yourself or portray yourself as a person with a research agenda, not as a research agenda with a person attached to it. You are more than your research, and you can provide more things to institutions than simply your research, even though this statement is focused specifically on that. So you want to also maintain a balance between being audience aware and audience mind reading. And so what I mean by this is it's really easy to slip in these statements into kind of this performative mindset where you're thinking about, okay, what are the people reading this statement? What are they looking for? And then trying to slot yourself into this ideal person that they're looking for. What that does is ends up with resulting in kind of a statement that's sort of inauthentic, and you can kind of see that. So what you want to really do is be aware of your audience, but also keep in mind, still the things that ground you as a researcher. So connecting what you authentically and aspirationally want to say to an awareness of your audience without trying to read their minds. You also want to have a balance between ambition and feasibility when you're thinking about the research agenda. And so, as a grounding statement, you want to come back to, aiming for portraying a realistic research agenda that can be accomplished in this institutional context. So, of course, you want to do something that is academically, intellectually interesting, as well as useful to society, or in whatever context usefulness means for you. Um, but you also want to make sure it's feasible, and the people reading this statement will want to see that you've given some thought to whether this particular research agenda is feasible in this institutional context. You also want to provide a balance between providing not enough detail and providing too much detail. Um, and so, what you want to do is aim to tell a compelling, curated story about your research trajectory, connecting past, present, and future you in the context of your research. And so the keyword here is going to be curated. So you want to include enough detail to be interesting, to tell a story, but you can't tell everything that has led to you working in this research, or all the minutiae of you being involved in this research. So you're going to have to pick and choose between the details you provide. And so at this point, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, this is so much to balance. But really, how will I know if I'm balancing these things well enough? And the truth is, and the answer is, even if it's uncomfortable, is you probably won't. And your advisor won't, and I won't. No one person will. And I want to emphasize, that's not because of any personal limitation on your part or my part or your advisor's part. So this is just simply the part of the nature of writing, is that as many authors as you have, you also have different readers who are going to be interpreting the text. And so our best advice that we can give you, and the takeaway, is to get feedback from many different feedback, or get feedback from many different people. The more people that you can get feedback from, the better. And we'll talk a little bit later about the sorts of audiences that will be probably looking at these statements in the context of hiring committees, but you never know who you might get the most valuable feedback from. So I would also say it's important to get discipline specific feedback, absolutely, because different fields and different disciplines will have different conventions when it comes to this research statement. And people outside the field may not necessarily be familiar with those conventions. But the insights about what makes your research compelling and exciting and interesting can come from all sorts of different people, even people that are not familiar with your field. So, if you take one thing away from this workshop, just take away that it's really important to get feedback from many different people. And we here at the Writing Hub are always happy to be those people and those sounding boards for you. So, another general principle as you're writing the statement, or really as you're writing anything, is to consider what we'll call the gap. And so, the gap in this context is going to be referring to the genre. So, what are the conventional expectations of what you're writing? So, if you think about this, maybe the genre of a horror movie or a mystery story. So there are certain conventions that people will expect, or certain things that people will expect, but you can kind of play within that, right? So the idea is that you have choices within constraints, and some of the constraints are going to be these genre conventions. You also want to consider the audience. Who is the audience that is going to be reading these, and what do they need? What sort of information you need to provide? And this particular piece is going to be intimately connected to purpose. What are we all even doing here? Which is, why am I even writing this document? Or what is the idea behind this document? What are they looking for with these documents? And what should I be considering as I'm thinking about it? Which is what this whole workshop is about. Okay, so that was a very short, maybe flippant way of talking about it. So let's unpack this a little bit further and go through the explicit and implicit reasons that committees require you to provide and want you to provide a research statement. So the research statement, it shouldn't be dry, it shouldn't be pedantic. It can be really easy to make it a regurgitation of your CV, and so stay away from that impulse. What it should be ideally is a lively document about who you are as a researcher and your voice. And you can think about this statement in relation to the other materials that you are sending to the committee, including your teaching statement, including your CV, including anything else. These are all going to be part of a whole um, package that is going to tell this committee who you are as a potential future colleague and researcher. So let's step back to the research statement and think about the genre for research statement specifically. So the explicit or the explicit reason that they're going to ask you for this is they want a short narrative that conveys your competencies as a researcher, including your relevant research to date and your plans for future research. So, an implicit reason that they might want this is they want to see if they find that your research fits into their department. Does it provide something that maybe they haven't been able to provide before at this institution? Is it interesting to them? Is it something that provides usefulness and whatever that means? And so there are some things in there that I want you to notice that you can control and that you can't control. And so I think it's most helpful to say, okay, we can't control everything and everyone's disposition or perception or anything else as they're reading their statements. So let's focus on the things we can control. And there is a lot, I promise you, that you can control in these statements. So let's think about the audience. When we're thinking about how we can provide control, some of that will come from knowledge. So let's think about who might be involved in these academic search committees. And I think one of the really important things to recognize is that academic search committees are composed of a variety of stakeholders. So at this point, you may have been involved in an academic search committee yourself, you may not. Um, but generally, what you are search committees will be composed of some combination of faculty, graduate students, and administrators, all with their own agendas and all with their own point of view when they're looking at your statements. So faculty might be considering, could this person be a good contributor to the department? Do I want to work with them for potentially the rest of my life? That's something to consider, right? When you're thinking about academic jobs, is you might be picking out colleagues for life. So that's something that they could be considering. Graduate students may be thinking, could this person be a good mentor? Does it seem like they're providing research opportunities of interest to me or to other graduate students that I know? And administrators might be thinking, could this person fulfill a faculty role on this campus, maybe aligning with some objectives that we have currently in our vision for the institution and what it might be in the future. And so the explicit purpose is to communicate a curated, again, curated, coherent account of your past, present, and future research. And kind of the hidden purpose or the implicit purpose is to demonstrate that you can and will contribute to this department and this university that you are applying to as a researcher, because this is your research statement. So you do not need to prove your worthiness in this statement. And so some of these things that sort of come out when in the writing when you're trying to prove your worthiness are things like pedantic prose, jargon, or a detailed version of your CV where you're including every single one of your wonderful research experiences. And so what happens with this is that it doesn't make it a very compelling story and it becomes very difficult to read. So you kind of need to um, curate. There's more work on the writer's end. Absolutely. You need to curate some of these experiences and talk about the things that add up to this story that you want to convey about yourself as a researcher. And so throughout this, you can just disregard that the voice that tells you your work isn't enough. Just put that aside. Um, it's not true anyway. And so we're going to put that aside. But what you do need to do is show who you are as a researcher, including your interests and your past research and your future research agenda. And so you can say yes to things like authenticity and aligning authentically um, with, this department and this institution with what really resonates with you. Come back to big picture themes. Think about telling stories. Stories are always compelling, and humans are always drawn to stories. And use your own voice. That will come together to create the most authentic research statement. And authentic research statements are just, and you'll see, hopefully, I think later on when we look at some examples, some of the more interesting to read research statements. They make it just easier to read. And so, as you're doing this, you can just welcome the voice that reminds you why you like and maybe even love this work. So, going back to some of those free writes that we did at the very beginning of this workshop. So, your writer's purpose as you're going throughout this statement is to show that you think deeply and reflectively about the research you've done, that you have a plan for keeping your research alive in the future, and that you are poised and ready to do research in this particular department and institution. So, how might you show this? How might you show that you think deeply and reflectively about the research you've done? One of the ways that you can do this is by organizing your statement by broader themes and questions as opposed to chronology. I think one of our first instincts when we're talking about our research experiences or really any experiences in our life is to go back to chronology because it's a very easy way of structuring things, but it's not always the most compelling way. So sometimes it can be more compelling to organize your statement by thinking about the broader themes and the broader questions that really inform your work. So, how might you show then that you have a plan for keeping your research alive? So, you can communicate your future directions aligned with these larger themes. And so, that's another one of the reasons why this structure of broader themes and questions can kind of come back and show this continuity um, between your research and what you plan to do in the future. And then, of course, another key point to this is that you are poised and ready to do research in this department and institution. And sometimes this requires having different, I would say often actually requires having different statements for different types of institutions. So you want to communicate how you'll pursue these different research directions in the particular institutional context to which you are applying. And don't worry, we're going to break all of these things down a little bit further. So don't worry about this anymore. And so I completely understand that chronology is often a very comfortable way of organizing things. And there really is nothing wrong with organizing your research chronologically. But as an organizing logic, it doesn't reveal much about you, and it may not be the most compelling way of conveying your research. And also, your research path might not have a natural chronological trajectory, which is absolutely okay. And it really doesn't help the reader see your plan for the future if you think about or if you organize everything chronologically. It asks the reader to infer. And when you ask readers to infer, or ask readers to guess what your intentions are, you run into problems where they might not guess or they might guess wrong. Um, so y- I want to propose thinking about organizing your research statement by research themes as an organizing principle. And so, as a reader, it's just easier and more interesting to read things that are organized by broad themes. It's more effective because it's easier to read. And from a hiring committee perspective, if we're thinking about our audience, it shows that the research can be applicable in more potential domains. So maybe this person can pursue grants and research opportunities or publish their work in a variety of journals. Their work speaks to all sorts of different things, which is just kind of the savvy thing to do in these research statements in general. And remember, this is about you as a researcher, not just your projects and work. So you are not a research agenda with a person attached. You are a researcher too. So these are some things that you can think about when if you're like, okay, so now I've decided I do want to organize my research statement by themes, and how might I do that? So you can kind of ask yourself these sorts of questions. So you can think about your work that contribute or your research work as it contributes to blank kinds of questions, work that advances or challenges blank kinds of theories, work that engages blank, whatever that may be in the research project, or work that can be applied to blank situations and problems. And on all of these different questions might help you think about the themes that are driving your research and your future research agenda. And so now is a time to kind of come back to your companion worksheet, and we're going to do a couple of exercises to get you thinking about how you might, thinking about the different organizing logics that you might choose between. So, first, what I want you to do is list your project and experiences in a chronological order. And with each project, I want you to write, what did you learn? And then try connecting what you learned to the next project and spend no more than 10 minutes on doing this. And after you've done this and thought about that a little bit, so give yourself 10 minutes, set a timer if you need to, then come back and I want you to draw a Venn diagram with 3 circles or use the Venn diagram in the companion worksheet that's provided, and consider 3 large themes, one theme each for each circle. And now take the projects and experiences that you listed in the first part of this exercise and fit them into the Venn diagram, including in the overlapping spaces as that makes sense. Okay, so now take 10 minutes, no more than 20 minutes to do each of these pieces, and then we'll come back. Welcome back. So at this point, we're going to talk about the second piece in your writer's purpose, which is communicating future directions aligned with these larger themes. And for the narrative in your research statement to be coherent, it needs to connect what happened in the past, which is your previous research, to where you are in the present, which is your current interests and ideas, to what you want to do in the future, your future research intentions. And you might start to see if you're trying to write a coherent narrative, chronological order is going to have a little bit more difficult of a time trying to do this work for you. And so, what you want to do is make these connections between the past and the present and the future explicit by explaining how past research leads to present ideas, which will motivate future projects in this thematic way. And as you're thinking about this, don't expect your reader to infer a guess. As I said earlier, they won't infer a guess or they'll guess wrong. Okay, so now we are on the next exercise. So let's try doing this. And so I want you to spend 5 minutes for each of these particular questions. So no more than 15 minutes each, or no more than 15 minutes total. So you can set a timer for yourself if that's helpful. And first, I want you to summarize what stands out to you about your past research work. Just 3 to 5 sentences max. Nothing too elaborate. Once you're done with that, I'd like you to think about what are you curious about these days and what do you want to explore? Spend 3 to 5 sentences on that. And then lastly, I want you to think about what projects can you imagine doing to pursue that curiosity. You can see how this kind of connects what stands out to you about your past research work as well as what you're interested in these days, and then describe what that looks like. Again, staying around 3 to 5 sentences and no more than 5 minutes for this exercise. So at this point, let's take a pause and then we'll come back together. Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about how you'll pursue future research directions in this particular institutional context. And so this is that balance that I was talking about between being audience aware and trying to be audience mind reading. So now we're just going to try to focus on being audience aware and thinking about who is the audience for these research statements and what do they need. So we talked about the audience. It could be a mix of, and likely will be a mix of faculty, administrators, and students in the department. And they'll probably be looking for different things. They'll be looking to see if you will be a good colleague or a mentor or department citizen in contributing to this intellectual and educational environment. They'll be looking for research contributions that will be valuable for this department, as well as research plans that are feasible in this institutional context. And so some ways of brainstorming for this section is to imagine your future research intentions against the backdrop of different institutional environments. And at this point, you might have had different experiences, for instance, with um, R1s, with primarily undergraduate colleges, with liberal arts colleges, all. And it's okay if you've only had, experience in one particular institutional context. I would say there's plenty of resources out there to kind of figure out what other institutions are like. And this is part of this fact finding that you'll be doing for this academic job market search that you have, is thinking about what these different institutional contexts and different institutional environments are like and what they would allow you to do. And I think that's just crucial work to do yourself as you are on the job market. So some of the things you can think about when you're thinking about your research statement is, what responsibilities do faculty have on this campus? Are students involved in research, and kind of to what capacity? What intramural resources, funding, and facilities are available to you? Are there centers or initiatives on the campus that you can tap into, or even centers and initiatives in the surrounding area and region that you can develop fruitful collaborations or working relationships with? So let's try it. So let's think about how you might pursue your future research projects, perhaps ones that you've brainstormed in an earlier part of this workshop, in each of the following institutional contexts. So just do a free write here and roughly sketch how you might pursue your current research interest in this context. And what sort of considerations or opportunities would you have in these different contexts? So the first context I want you to consider is a large public state university. This would be something like a CSU, ASU, Oregon State, Iowa State. Then next, consider a small, primarily undergrad university, something like Swarthmore, Occidental, or JMU. And then lastly, a large public research university, like where we are now in a UC, perhaps Michigan, Washington, University of North Carolina, or something like that. And take about 10 to 15 minutes to do this. I would say no more than 5 minutes for each of these brainstorming things. And just remember as you're doing this that research statements are not one size fits all. And of course, they're going to reflect the nature of your research, your level of experience and expertise, and the type of institution that you are applying. And so this is the part where you're keeping in mind sort of the needs of the institution to which you are applying, and the realities of the facilities and teaching loads and institutional or external support that you'll have in this location. And at this point, you might want to consider the current research programs of the faculty at the institution that you're applying for. and even consider explaining how your proposed research program could broaden or complement the current program. And again, as I said before, if you're applying to several different types of job opportunities, as many of us are, you might need several versions of your research statement, and that's absolutely okay. So now take the time to do this. Welcome back. So here are some additional things that you might want to consider as you're writing your research statement. So you might want to consider tangible products of current research. So these would be things like funding, any official recognition and awards, conference presentations, reports, manuscripts, books, and in general, any kind of recognition that's relevant to your field. Different fields will have different types of products that they consider as being evidence of your past research. And the reason that you want to include these is because of the participation aspect of research. So in the research statement, although you do want to be considering your audience, you also want to invoke the whole field and not just the department, because research is this very participatory process with all of these different societies and their own interests involved as well. You might also consider tangible projects for products for future work. And this is kind of a savvy thing to do because it also shows that you have a plan for keeping your research alive. So consider mentioning journals where you might publish, funding opportunities or grants you might pursue to support this research, partnerships with other research institutes or community centers in this area, and also consider this connection to the field and the research community. Um, so just like I was saying, you want to demonstrate that you're part of a research community, that you are part of this whole field and not just this department that either you're currently in or that you're applying for. You want to show that you are really interested in contributing to this participation aspect of the research, some of which you'll have shown by discussing the tangible projects. But and you can also show in other ways as well. Okay, so at this point, we are going to pause and come back to this workshop in a separate section. We've finished kind of discussing or pulling apart what a research statement is, what the genre is, who the audience is, and what your writer's purpose is. And now we'll start thinking about um, reading for writing. So come back to us and we'll see you in the next video.